Today we have two great speakers, each one talking about a very different task, a very different imaging modality. The first one is Dr. Sergio Sanabria of Stanford University, who I had the pleasure of meeting and chatting with earlier today. He's going to talk about the next generation cancer diagnosis, empowering ultrasound as a ubiquitous high-precision diagnostics tool, specifically using not only the ultrasound image that we're used to seeing, but using the raw data to extract deeper information about the various tissue characteristics. Our second speaker will be Dr. Qingyu Zhao, also of Stanford University, who will talk about Confounder-aware deep learning neuroimaging studies, specifically in MRI imaging modality. So without further ado, I'd like to invite Dr. Sanabria to give his presentation.
So thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to be here, and thank you very much, especially to Mose, for organizing it. I have a very strong Spanish accent, I warn you, so I will try to speak slowly. And if something is not clear afterwards, we can, in the Q&A, probably look a bit more forward into it. So as the introduction was saying, I am looking into using ultrasound as not only a qualitative tool for inspection of the body as we are used to. We know, everybody knows echography, baby ultrasound, trying to find body structures in the body, but trying to see if we can do more with ultrasound, if we can make it a quantitative tool which can help us for diagnostics. This is something that is nowadays done in other modalities like MR, CT, but in ultrasound, for some reason, it has not been explored so much until now, and we want to see what we can really get out of ultrasound data. There is more to it than just the images. So very brief, a couple of words about myself. I am from Spain, but I have been living for a long time in Switzerland. So I did my PhD and a couple of positions more in ETH Zurich. That's the Polytechnical Swiss University in Zurich. And since 1 year, I'm working as well in the University Hospital of Zurich. So we are trying to build a group there where we are mixing technical expertise and clinical expertise. Just let me see if I'm actually looking right. No, my bad, I'm in the wrong presentation. Okay, there we are. Okay. Okay. So there we are. So we are trying to build a mixed technical clinical group where we are developing new technologies, imaging technologies directly for the doctors. So we are called the Zurich Ultrasound Research and Translation Group. So it's a very mixed combination of clinical doctors and engineering expertise. We have started doing this, as I say, like 1 year ago, so we are still a bit small, but we are growing quickly. And our target is really the translation of technology from the workbench to the patient. So we very often see technologies developed in technical universities which are tested with simulations, with phantoms, but don't really make the step of going to the clinic and really going to the patients. And there are a lot of challenges there that we have to take into account. So we are very, very close. Whatever we are doing is tested immediately on the patients. And our mission is to objectivize ultrasound measurements. So really try to get quantitative information out of this data. And we believe that having an interdisciplinary approach with people from different disciplines, we can really make it happen. So some things we are looking into, and I will be speaking about today, are breast cancer. This was one project I have been working since 2015, where we were trying to use ultrasound to diagnose or to monitor the risk of developing breast cancer, first thing, by quantification of the breast density. I will speak a little bit about this later, what that means, and as well diagnosis. So not only able to make images of the breast cancer tumors, but as well be able to say which of these two images actually has a cancer there, and which of them is a benign lesion, which is nothing to worry about, which is not something so obvious for a person that is not an expert. Secondly, we have been looking into aging, which is as well a very relevant clinical problem. So how the muscles are degenerating with age and losing functionality. So we want to look into this problem as well with ultrasound. And the third problem that we have recently started looking at is liver disease. So there is, apart from the alcoholic liver disease, cirrhosis, that everybody is familiar with, there is a non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, which is more silent, unfortunately, and is affecting a big amount of the population. And currently, you can only diagnose it properly with biopsy. So we want to see as well if we can do something with ultrasound. So these are the problems we are looking at. So let's start a little bit with the breast cancer problem. So big problem, 1 in 8 women are affected by this disease. There is an issue as well with the screening policies. We don't want to screen too many women because of radiation hazards with the mammography. However, there are a lot of cancers that are affecting younger women. And as well, there is a condition that is called the dense breast tissue, which means that some women have more glandular tissue in their breast that leads actually to 4 times more risk of developing breast cancer and as well more difficult to detect cancers in the mammography. So these are a little bit the constellation. And what we have nowadays is basically the mammography to screen the women and see if some of them have something suspicious. And once we have some suspect something is going on, the only reliable way actually is to do a biopsy to check if the cancer is good or bad. There is other modalities like MR, ultrasound, which are contributing a little bit to this picture, but these are the main 2. However, we cannot do mammography in all the women. And as well, with these technologies, we are not detecting all the tumors. We are detecting 80% almost, and in dense breast tissue, we are detecting only like 60%. And we have a lot of false positives, which lead to overdiagnosis and as well cause a lot of money to the clinical system. So why not to use ultrasound? I mean, it's a radiation-free modality, widely available, painless. We don't need to compress the breast. It's affordable, easy to use. And actually, it has been shown in studies that ultrasound is very, very sensitive to detecting early-stage cancer, sometimes better than X-rays. The problem about ultrasound is that it leads to a lot of false positives. It's very much operator-dependent and difficult to interpret what's happening. So actually, if we would do ultrasound for all the women, we would get like double false positives that we get nowadays with mammography, which would probably be a lot of overdiagnosis we don't want to do. So that's a little bit the problem we have nowadays. The problem is, out of such images, how to know which one is the cancer and which one is not. So the first thing we were starting doing was to develop a new technology based on conventional ultrasound, but doing something totally different. So when we have a conventional ultrasound image, what we are doing is we send some waves with our probe. This has a lot of elements inside, and we get reflections, which we afterwards focus in different points and allow us to get such an image on grayscale where we can see some structures, potentially some tumors, for instance. So what we were trying is not to get this qualitative image of texture of the body, but to measure how fast do the waves travel in the tissue as a biomarker. So we were starting with a very simple approach with a reflector on the other side of the breast, and we were measuring amongst multiple trajectories how fast did the waves travel through the tissue. The heuristics that found and the preliminary literature evidence was that the faster the wave travels, the stiffer or the more distorted the tissue is, and this could give us potentially a biomarker for breast cancer differentiation. Our main contribution was to do this in a simple way based on a conventional ultrasound probe. So here we could, for instance, see that the malign lesion is actually not the one that is darker, but the one that we are seeing on the top, whereas the benign lesion would show a less significant increase of speed of sound. So this would be a first heuristic to go on with, like we can measure a quantitative biomarker that allows us to differentiate different types of lesions. So, I mean, we were not the first ones trying to measure this speed of sound parameter, but these were the systems that were available at the time commercially, and that is still the only commercial solution, which actually does not look at all like an ultrasound machine. It's a very complex system where you have to immerse the breast in a water bath and scan it from all directions to be able to measure these time measurements that allow us to measure the speed of sound. And you can get really nice images with these kind of systems where you can see the tissue microstructure and as well the speed of sound variations, and you can get some fuse image which you can identify the tumors. But certainly this is not something that you can so easily insert in the primary care or in a clinical routine with another modalities. So what we were trying to do really is to have a feature within the existing ultrasound systems, in every ultrasound system that is around, where you could just press a key and you could get a speed of sound image of some reasonable quality next to the image that, that you have showing the texture of the lesion. So I can speak a little bit about how we did that, about the math and stuff. So it was basically a limited angle tomography problem. Probably some of you are familiar with the cone beam CT and this kind of X-ray tomography systems where you don't have access to all the directions. So this was a little bit the problem we had. We have the ultrasound probe on the top, we had the reflector behind, and we could not access to directions of the wave like that. We could only access to limited angles. So if we would try to reconstruct that, we would get, initially, this was the state of the art before we started, you would get images like that, which are very much distorted due to the missing information. They are not really usable. Yeah, they show really very coarse resolution, and you cannot really get quantitative values for diagnostics because with respect to the model, they are already very distorted. So we started looking into different kinds of regularization that could help us to solve this problem. First thing we looked at was compressive sensing. This is something that is as well used very much in MR and CT when you have limited data. And it was getting a bit better, so we could see a little bit the directions, the inclusions a little bit better. Some of the values were coming closer to the model, but still it was not acceptable. Then we started looking a bit more farther into it. So we were looking like, how can we leverage the information that we have into different directions? So we invented a new way of regularizing called an isotropically weighted total variation, which takes actually the information you have in each direction into account. And doing this thing, it was working better. So we could get images of very acceptable quality, which were very much resembling the model. And actually, the values were as well very accurate, like less than 5% error, that we could actually use them for diagnostics. Then, since we are talking today about artificial intelligence, artificial intelligence came a bit to help us. So we were realizing at some point, okay, we have done a lot of research on regularization, but at some point it's difficult to establish regularization constraints because, I mean, the math is complex, and you can only say things like, okay, I want to leverage angle information, I want to search for close inclusion geometries. Still, it's like very coarse heuristics that you are putting there. So we were trying to learn the regularization with a deep learning approach. And this was actually working quite nicely. It was improving a little bit image quality, and more important, it was improving significantly the reconstruction time. So we could put this now into a GPU, and we could have our reconstruction in some milliseconds. So we were about to have a modality that was running in real time adjacent to an ultrasound image, and what's giving us a new biomarker that was not available so far. So we tried they were very excited at ETH, and we got a prize for the best patent of the year, and we started doing a spin-off project. So we developed a prototype that could bring this thing into the clinic. And the fundraising was quite significant, so we could do a lot of clinical studies, but the turnover was we were selling 2 systems, one to ETH and one to the University Hospital of Zurich to make the validation. So we really did not put it into the market. What we did was to enable the translation of the system to the hospital. And here I can show a little bit a video where you can see a little bit how the system was looking like at the time. Oh, I'm going to put the sound away. So we had this reflector tool that we were using. This is a breast phantom, so still no real breast. Oh, actually, I didn't want to put the sound. Okay. So basically, what you are seeing is you need to put the probe on one side of the breast. I don't know if you can see it properly here. And the reflector on the other side. And then we are detecting the reflector automatically as well with a machine learning algorithm. Then we are pressing this key on the ultrasound system, and suddenly we have below the conventional ultrasound image, and on the top we have in real time almost the speed of sound image. So we can see, for instance, there is a lesion there very clearly that we are able to detect with our method. So we are coming one step closer to having an imaging modality that we can integrate in an ultrasound system. Still, we need to have this reflector, which you can imagine, if you have a real breast of a woman, it's going not to be so easy to find the lesion and put the reflector behind. You have to be sure that you have coupling gel on both sides of the thing. It works. We were measuring around 20 women with that, and they were not complaining too much. It's not painful at all or so, but it's cumbersome. And if you want to have the small lesions that are close to abdominal chest, it's going to be difficult. So this was our first attempt, let's say like that. But then we decided we needed to go clinical and start looking into things that were more real, based on these ideas. So we started running studies. The first study we ran was not focused on the lesions because this was already a complex problem. What we were looking was at the full breast. So we wanted to characterize which breasts were dense and which breasts were not dense. So we had as a reference the mammography. So this is a mammography of adipose breast with a lot of fat, where you see it's very, very there is nothing there, basically. And as it gets denser and denser, you have more and more glandular tissue till you get to the highest density category. The problem about this density category is twofold, as I have said before. On one side, they have a higher cancer risk, like 4 times. And on the other hand, if you have a tumor there, it becomes difficult for the radiologist to find it because the dense tissue is masking the presence of the tumor. So what we could show with the speed of sound is that we were able to actually say, before doing the first mammography, if the woman has one of these 4 categories. So this was quite a nice add-on to be able to decide which women are more eligible for X-ray mammography, if they have easy to interpret breast, or which women are probably better suited for MR or ultrasound if they have very dense breast. So this was the first application we developed. Second, we were going for the big problem where we wanted to differentiate the tumors. So these are, again, the 2 images I was showing before, where I don't know if any of you wants to make a guess which one is the cancer and which one is the benign one. So maybe raise hands the ones who think the top one is the cancer. Okay, so we have like 5 opinions out of 40, 50. Okay, and the one below. So now if I show you these 2 speed of sound images, which one would you think is the cancer? The one on the top, yeah. So actually, this was the case, yeah. Actually, it's written wrong. It's carcinoma is malignant and fibroadenoma is benign, so don't take me on that one. It's wrong written. So the top one is the cancer, and the bottom one is the benign lesion, actually. The fibroadenoma is safe, nothing to worry about. So as you can see, to have a speed of sound image was helping us already, not having any experience, to make a better diagnosis of what we had. And accuracy was actually quite high, so we were getting an area of the curve of 0.930. It's not sufficient, maybe, but it's good to start having something quantitative that it is superior to the ultrasound, for sure. Little bit some more details how we did that. So this was the density approach. So we were measuring different segments of the breast, the speed of sound as profile, so we could see very clearly if we have a low density, low risk, we have lower speed of sound values. If we have a high density, high risk, we are having an increase, which actually is following even the density profile. As I was saying before, the reflector was quite cumbersome for the tumors, so we went over that, and we designed a new way of doing things which didn't require a reflector. So basically, there is a paper about that, but what we were doing was no reflector at all needed anymore. We were looking at the breast from different directions and generating images from different directions. You can think on a camera, photographic camera, which has aberrations, and the aberrations will be caused by the changes of the speed of sound when generating the images that we are not taking into account. So if we have these images from different directions, actually we can co-register them and measure the aberrations that are caused by this speed of sound variations. And once we have these aberrations measured, we can reconstruct a speed of sound image as well with a limited computed tomography problem, which gives us this speed of sound image. So this is how we were proceeding. So this was already one step further, getting rid of the reflector, which as well opened us access to other organs of the body that were not accessible on both sides. Then we started looking, okay, is this only good for breast cancer? Can we do more things with it? So looking at the literature, I mean, there was a lot of literature from the 70s and the 80s where they were just taking ex vivo specimens and measuring how fast the waves travel through them. We knew that, I mean, this can be something good for differentiating cancer from glandular tissue or fibroadenomas, but it's as well a very powerful tool for differentiating fat, adipose tissue, from other tissues like liver, for instance, or muscles. So the next thing we were starting to look at was sarcopenia. I don't know if you are familiar with this illness. It's actually affecting a lot of people, 25% of people over 60 and 60% of the people over 80. It's basically the degeneration of the muscles with age. It can as well be caused by other reasons, for instance, cancer. And basically what is going on is that your muscles are losing muscular content and they are becoming more and more fatty, so they are as well losing function. And there is currently, surprisingly, not really a good standard for this, so most of the assessment is done in a qualitative way by checking what is the physical condition of the patient. And if you want to check some modality, what nowadays is done is a lot of CT, which requires radiation, so you would not do that unless you have really a more severe problem, or MR, which is expensive. So we were trying to see if we could use this speed of sound technology to quantify the fat in the muscles. So we were first starting with a very simple population. We took 10 patients that were healthy and young, and we took 10 old patients which were in wheelchairs and were really having problems. And we realized that, okay, there was quite a good way to differentiate that. And then we went forward and said, okay, we don't want just to have two populations. We want really to have some quantification of something. So we started taking whatever we could as a reference. So the gold standard that we have nowadays for sarcopenia quantification is CT, computed tomography. And basically what they do is they measure an slice on the abdomen, and they measure the size of this muscle here, which is called the psoas. And actually, this one, actually. And so this is a very different thing from what we were trying to measure with the speed of sound, because in the speed of sound, what we were doing is to measure in the calves, on the thigh. So it was far away and so on. But still, we could find a very promising correlation between the speed of sound values in the thigh and the L3 slice gold standard. Which actually, if you think about it, maybe the ultrasound is doing better, because we are measuring actually in the muscles we are interested in. We are measuring in the legs. We are not measuring in the abdomen somewhere, which maybe is not so relevant for the frailty of the patient. Then we went one step further, and we said, okay, let's take MR, which is non-invasive for the patient, so we can measure out of a big population. And let's check if we can measure the fat content in the thighs, directly where we are measuring with ultrasound, with MR. And let's see if we can compare the fat fraction measured with MR with the fat fraction measured with the speed of sound. And we found, obviously, that there is a better correlation because we are measuring at the same position, so we were getting already over 0.8. And so this was showing us that actually we can quantify fat content with ultrasound, something that was not possible until then. And this was the first time, actually, that we got some visibility on the radiology journals, which I think is important to bring these technologies to the clinics. So they were saying, oh, sarcopenia, could we do it today with ultrasound and tomorrow with the smartphones? So let's see, maybe we can. We were as well looking a little bit as a comment into sports medicine, because as well the muscles is a topic there. So we did a small study that we have submitted to European Radiology, in which we were trying to compare the two legs after they had a cast in the leg for several weeks, to see if we could see if one leg has recovered better with respect to the other. I mean, the leg that did not have any cast was mobile, the other one was immobilized. And we saw there was a correlation with the number of days of immobilization. So there was, even in the short term, there was a degeneration of the muscle due to the immobilization that we could detect with the speed of sound. It was as well a very interesting study because we could analyze other things like, does the angle where we are measuring have an influence? Does the force that is being applied in the muscle has an influence? These are things that are typically confounders in ultrasound. And we saw that actually this technology was quite unaffected by that. So we were seeing that actually it's a very good technology for fat quantification, irrespective of everything else. Then we were starting hearing more and more about machine learning, artificial intelligence. And I was initially skeptic about it, but then I saw this contribution, which is nice to see if you have some time. So this they did in Georgia Tech. It's a very interesting thing. Is the Luke Skywalker hand. So this is a person that does not have the lower part of the arm and the hand. And what they were doing is they were putting an ultrasound sensor here, and they were using these images to train which key of the keyboard he wanted to play. And you would say, I mean, this is kind of a crazy problem because, I mean, what is the physics and the modeling behind that? But it actually works for some reason, and it was showing a superior performance to electromyography. So this was showing us that probably deep learning is able to learn things in ultrasound that maybe we are not even understanding how it's learning, but it seems to be working. So it was quite an exciting example. And we were starting looking a little bit into that. So, I mean, first we did what everybody else has been doing around. So we were doing a study in the hospital where we were doing breast cancer classification with ultrasound images. So we had some hundreds of ultrasound images, and some of them were benign, some were malignant. They were just conventional ultrasound black, these black grayscale images that I showed before. And we saw that actually we could improve quite a bit, and we could achieve an area under the curve of 0.84 with ultrasound if we would have a deep learning algorithm behind. So actually we could have, as in other modalities, something that could help the radiologist to make better decisions. So it was a similar performance of the performance of a very, very experienced radiologist working with ultrasound for years. And that was like the best you could get. Then we started doing simple tests, like, for instance, let's put the speed of sound images into an artificial neural network and see if we can get a bit better classification. We didn't have so many images at the point. We have only a couple of dozens of images. But still, we could see, OK, there was some potential for a little bit of improvement if we, instead of just making a threshold of the image, we put the full image into the network. And we as well saw that if we have a few images, obviously with B-mode it's going to take a lot of images to be able to learn. With conventional ultrasound, it's going to take a lot of images to learn to classify tumors. Whereas with speed of sound, for instance, just having a part of dozens of images, we were already getting convergence. So this was as well showing that maybe if we can generate data that is easier to learn, we can as well get better performance in learning. We were as well looking into the sarcopenia problem with that. So this was as well very, very simple thing. We were just taking the conventional ultrasound images that look like that with these funny textures. And we were just having our healthy population, our sarcopenic population. And we were trying to see if the network is able to learn that just with these simple images. It was actually very good because the network was able to learn. We had a data set of 100 images, and just training the network with 25% of the images, it was able to learn the other 75% correctly, which was like, OK, that's not such a bad issue. It seems to be an easy problem to learn. So what we did to compare, we gave the same problem to a radiologist and tried to figure out how many images would the radiologist need to learn herself to classify this properly. And we figured out, actually, to do it without any mistakes, she needed to see half of the images first before she could classify correctly the other half. So it was maybe a small observation. I don't know if very generalizable, but in this case, the deep learning network required less images visible to be able to learn correctly than the radiologist. It was like, oh, seems to be doing some nice stuff. So this was a bit our test. And now I will say a couple of words about my work in Stanford. So I am in the group of Professor Jeremy Dahl, and as well working very close together with Ahmed Nagy El-Kafas. So we are trying to apply this kind of quantitative ultrasound technologies to other problems that are maybe a bit more complex. They have like different processes going on simultaneously in the body. And we want to, as well, not only restrict ourselves to this speed of sound technology, but we want to see if we can integrate more stuff together and get better performance. So we are looking into non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. So this is really an important problem that is going to be very significant in clinical imaging in the next years. So it has a prevalence rate of 25%. It is asymptomatic, so you don't need to drink alcohol to get this disease. And it's about fat accumulation in the liver.
Is it related to hepatitis C?
Exactly, steatosis and steatohepatitis. And as it is about fat, obviously, if you are obese, you have more probability to get it. So 90% of the patients with obesity will have this in some degree. But the interesting thing is that 20% of people who are apparently healthy, they don't have any problem, they will as well have this problem. And if this goes through all the stages of development, it can become, and it is already a leading cause of liver failure. So nothing to be said as a small thing. It's actually becoming more important even than the cirrhosis. And about the question that I was receiving, yeah, it is, we have a normal liver. First, we have fat accumulation in the liver, which leads to steatosis. This is often harmless, so if it stays there, the patient will not have really a big problem. The problem is when it progresses to the next stage, which is NASH. This is steatohepatitis, which is not only fat accumulation, but is as well inflammation and a little bit of fibrosis. And this is already a bad thing because it's very associated to development of cirrhosis and not development of liver cancer. And the numbers are that it implies a 2.8% risk of death per person per year. And the problem is that radiology, not a single modality at the moment, can differentiate between this guy and this guy. So we can with MR and with CT, we can measure fat in the liver, but we cannot get the three of them, which we need to really differentiate these two populations. So the only way that they do it nowadays is with a biopsy, which you will only do if you have another reason to do it, because I mean, to do a biopsy of the liver is not something that you would just do for a screening. And where we can see really these features of fat accumulation and as well inflammation and differentiate these two very clearly. Even visually, I think you would be able to differentiate between these two images. No? So basically, we are looking into three features. One is fat accumulation, adipositas. The other one is tissue inflammation. And the other one is tissue stiffening, which is the conventional fibrosis. So the question is, can we use ultrasound in some sense to achieve the three of them separately and combine them into a marker of steatohepatitis? So I have spoken a lot about fat quantification with the speed of sound technology. So there is other technologies for years in the market for stiffness quantification. This is the so-called elastography. Probably some of you are familiar with it. There is as well an MR elastography, magnetic resonance elastography, which is quite used. And there are some devices in the market which are able to measure the stiffness of the liver. And this has proved very useful for alcoholic liver disease to detect cirrhosis, especially at advanced stages. It's not so sensitive at early stages, but the advanced cirrhosis you can detect. However, it's not a technology that is really working for quantifying liver adipositas. So we are looking into multimodality approaches. So could we use elastography for stiffness quantification combined with the speed of sound for liver adipositas quantification? Could we use other biomarkers for inflammation? And yeah, so our first results are showing actually that we can get correlations already between ultrasound biomarkers and fat quantification with MR. So we are in the steatosis stage already working quite properly. And what we are seeing now is that if we combine multiple biomarkers, actually we can get performances that are superior to the qualitative assessment that was done so far with ultrasound. This as well about how to combine these biomarkers together. And just to finalize, I have 2 slides more. So we have spoken so far about model-driven approaches where we are having some physical intuition behind what we are doing, and we are generating some images, and then we are using them for classification. But I would like to ask to bring a bit of attention to the nature of the raw data itself. So we have an ultrasound image. All these echo signals that the probe is acquiring constitute several gigabytes of data that are helping us to generate the image. And that afterwards, after all the compression, the modulation, and process that leads to the image, they are just reducing to some kilobytes, just to put some numbers. So if we would be able to actually make our analysis of the data directly here, maybe we could learn much more than what we are doing nowadays by doing deep learning, all the examples I showed so far just on the final images. And I will show an example. Oh, what's happening here? Yeah, here. So we were doing a first test on this respect. We were trying to train a network without any knowledge of any physical model to learn steatosis, just fat quantification. So we had a small population of patients, just 35, and we were doing a lot of patches inside the liver images. And we were trying to compare what would happen if instead of using conventional ultrasound images, we would use the raw data directly. So we were having, on one side, the ultrasound images, where we were taking patches. On the other side, we were having the raw echo data, which we were making some transformations to make it a bit more simple representation in the spectral domain, but still was keeping most of the information there.
And when you train your data, how you label this? Using cardiology reading?
So in this case, we have MR for each of the patients. And from MR, we could quantify the proton density fat fraction, and we could classify the patients in all the steatosis grades.
Different doctors can have a different opinion about if it is fatty liver or not.
Yeah, but if you do it with MR, then you get some quantitative value of fat fraction, and then the opinion is where you set the thresholds, basically. So we just set some thresholds, and according to what is done in the literature. So here you see, like less than 5% fat, we say is nothing. Mild is 5 to 15, moderate is 15 to 25, and bad is over 25. Another doctor would say something different, but at the end of the day, you have to decide on a standard. So we use these as labels, these classifications of the MR. And then basically we use the same network architecture. It was kind of a basic convolutional neural network, the typical things with the max pooling and some full convolutional layers at the end of it. And we use the same architecture for both the B mode and the raw data. We changed the hyperparameters a bit to optimize for both of kinds of data sets and to get the best possible performance we could get. And what we were seeing, this is just very, very recent test, is that actually we were getting a bit better if we were using the raw data in this primary form. So the accuracy was increasing by 5%, and the loss was decreasing by 20% by using the raw data. And actually what we saw is that if we brought this to the patient level, we could discriminate very, very early steatosis stages really for this population in the validation data set for 100% of the patients. So we had 8 of the patients where this was performing perfectly, which was improving quite a bit with respect to what we could do if we were just using the B-mode images. So this was for us very promising, and we are going to look more into using raw data for classification of disease. End-to-end. This was really an end-to-end deep learning approach. So just to finalize, I think I'm going over my time. Some conclusions. So what I want to transmit with this presentation is there is much more to see in ultrasound than what you see in the final images that you normally have in your ultrasound system. So there is a lot of raw data there, which has a lot of physical information. Some of them we can tap by understanding how ultrasound waves travel. Some of it probably we can even tap without understanding what is going on, but just by having a right training model. So biomechanical models, speed of sound, elastography, others can augment ultrasound, providing new adjoint modalities. So we can have actually multiple types of images in our ultrasound system, like we do with MR, different sequences. We can use AI to develop these modalities, for instance, to make them real time, as we saw with the speed of sound. We can as well use machine learning to combine biomarkers with different approaches into more robust predictors. Speed of sound is something we have been working in, and it's very nice for tissue microstructure and density quantification. And it's kind of a new complementary technology to what elastography is doing. However, for complex disease, it's not going to be enough. We need to combine different biomarkers. For instance, we were discussing inflammation, fat concentration, and stiffness. So having all of these together, we will be able to make a more accurate multi-biomarker profiling of disease. And last but not least, probably we can use AI to learn directly new biomarkers directly from the raw data without having any preliminary knowledge about what we are doing. So thank you very much for your attention, and really happy for questions afterwards.
So I'd like to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Zhao, from Stanford University. He's a postdoctoral research fellow at the Department of Psychiatry. He'll talk about Confounder-aware learning and neuroimaging studies. Right.
Okay. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you for having me here. I'm Qingyu Zhao. Today I'm going to talk about an important topic in the intersection between deep learning and neuroscience. So as we all already know that deep learning methods are emerging basically everywhere. They're being applied in basically every discipline, for example, in the last talk in ultrasound. And that is certainly true in neuroscience. People are using deep learning methods to differentiate, for example, healthy brains versus diseased brains with the aim of detecting the impact of disease on the brain. And this topic is actually established for decades before the deep learning era. Traditionally, if people want to do this type of analysis, it's usually hypothesis-driven. So what I mean is that if we want to detect the impact of a disease on the brain, usually you have a sort of a hypothesis. You have assumption that how the disease might impact the brain. For example, a certain type of disease might shrink screen matter, cortical thickness of the brain. Once you have the hypothesis, you can start collecting data of two cohorts, one group of healthy subjects and another group of diseased ones. And then you can derive imaging measurements from the images based on the hypothesis. In this case, you derive, for example, cortical thickness of gray matter at different brain regions. And then you can perform analysis. Usually it's a univariate statistical test that apply to each one of these measurements. And finally, you collect those measurements that show significantly different measurements between two groups. And that's how the analysis is being performed. And right now with deep learning, all those steps are basically condensed into one model. You have a bunch of images with the labels, and you want to perform end-to-end training to predict the diagnosed label from the images. And more importantly, on top of having an accurate prediction, we want to understand what does the model actually learn. In other words, we want to understand which brain regions are being used by the model to make the prediction, because those regions are essentially indicators of the impact of the disease. So right now there are a lot of people with deep learning background entering the field of neuroscience. What I observe is that there's a very big pitfall that people are usually overlooking when performing deep learning-based analysis. That is the existing of confounding effects. So a confounder, formally speaking, is a variable that correlates both the what I call exposure, basically their neuroimages, and they also the confounder also correlates with the outcome, which is the diagnosis label. When there's a confounding effects between the images and the labels, there are essentially erroneous associations between the two variables. And right now, if you want to put a deep learning model trying to predict labels from the images, I'm pretty sure that the deep learning model are powerful enough to pick up this wrong association. So this is what I mean by confounding effect. To give a more concrete example, for example, age in many neuroimaging studies is a very important confounder, because we all know that our brain develops a lot when we are aging. For example, this work is from one of my previous works. It reveals that from year 18 to year 86, your ventricle is expanding by a large extent. So we all know that age impacts your structure of the brain. On the other hand, the age also impacts diagnosis label. For example, in neurodegenerative diseases, for example, Alzheimer, if you look at the age distribution, mostly diseased people are elderly. If you look at another type of disease, HIV, you have a different type of skewed distribution, age distribution in your patients. So now if you try to randomly recruit two groups of subjects, I'm pretty sure that the control subjects will have a different age span than the diseased subjects. So right now, if you try to build a model here to predict the diagnosis label from the images, probably the model is not trying to predict whether you are a diseased or a healthy person. Probably it's just trying to predict whether you're an older or a younger person. So this is what I mean by this confounding effect. In fact, other than age, all these other demographic information can be potentially confounders of the study. And this is a very troublesome problem, because when we eventually want to interpret the model, try to visualize which brain regions are impacted by the disease, we are actually not sure in this picture which voxels or which regions are impacted by the disease, or they are actually being impacted by the confounding effects or aging effects, for example, in the previous example. So now I want to talk about several models that we developed, basically all stages of deep learning that can properly handle this demographic information. So specifically, I'm going to talk about how to build generative models that can leverage this demographic information. I'm also going to talk about how to train your neural network that can handle confounders. Finally, I want to introduce a technique, a visualization technique that guarantees that the visualization, the heat maps are confounder-free. Okay, so I'm going to first talk about building generative models that are dependent on your demographic information. For example, I'm going to use, again, age as a simple example. So if we want to build an association between a subject's age and its neuroimage, me as a computer scientist, I first think about building a regression model that predict the subject's age from their neuroimage. But from neurogenerative, from the neuroscience perspective, actually the reverse direction is more interesting. That is, given a specific age, I want to understand what a typical brain looks like for that age. Or alternatively, the question could be how an older brain different from a younger brain. So we're interested in learning this generative process from age to the brain image. And a direct application of this generative model, of course, is that we can basically augment your data set while strictly controlling your confounders. For example, we can augment two data sets with well-matched age range. This is a direct application of this generative process. Okay, so I'm going to learn this generative model with a variational autoencoder framework. If you familiar with it. Essentially, I want to learn this decoder that can simulate an image from a latent representation. So eventually, I want to achieve something like the bottom. If you're familiar with the standard VAE, that the latent representations usually form a non-informative unit Gaussian. And what I want to achieve here is that I want to have our latent representations being dependent on age, which is color-coded by this color scale. Okay, so I'm going to first do a little bit review of the standard framework. So you first got to have define a generative process for a variational autoencoder. Essentially, you want to assume that your image X is generated by a latent representation Z. And the goal, of course, is to learn an encoder network and decoder network parameterized by P and P of theta by minimizing a so-called variational lower bound of the maximum likelihood of the data. So if you're familiar with VAE, you're probably familiar with this objective, which is the lower bound that you want to minimize. It has two terms. The first one, of course, is the reconstruction error. It just says that when you feed an image into this encoding, decoding process, it's better to spit out the same, exact same input, same image as the input. And the second term is usually understood as a regularization. It means that when you try to encode the image into a probability distribution in the latent space, that distribution is better to be close to the prior of Z, which is usually a non-informative unit Gaussian. And here what I want to do is that I basically want to incorporate the age information, which I call variable C here, into the overall model. And this can be achieved by combining the aforementioned unsupervised standard VAE with a sort of a supervised age regression network. So I'm going to slightly change the generative process. I'm going to just say that the latent representation Z is dependent on your age. So this is the conditional probability here. With this generative process, you can basically use the same variational inference procedure to derive the lower bound. And the trick is that you want to learn an encoder that can jointly predict your latent representation and your age from a given image. And of course, I'm going to adopt a mean field theory kind of approximation to say that, okay, this encoder can be factorized into two separate predictors. Okay, so I'm not going to list all the mathematical derivation here, but this is essentially the lower bound, the variational lower bound you want to optimize eventually. The first term is the reconstruction error. What is different is the second term. If you remember the regularization, previously the regularization is trying to push the encoding, encoded latent representation to be a single Gaussian. And what is different here, I just want to say that, okay, now I want to encode your latent representation to be close to your age-specific prior. This is what the conditional probability of P of Z condition on C says. So basically, given the C, P of Z condition on C is the age-specific prior in the latent space, and I want to learn an encoder that can produce that latent representation close to this P of Z condition on C. And lastly, this is where you can impose some supervised training on this regressor age prediction. Basically, you can, when you have the ground truth age of the subjects, you can perform supervised training to learn this age regressor. And another interesting assumption that we can make is that we can assume all the nonlinearity of the model can be absorbed into this decoder part, so that we can simply use a linear function to parameterize this conditional probability, which I call a linear latent generator here, because essentially what it says is that given an age C, I want to generate a age-dependent latent representation Z. And this parameterization is just a linear function encoded by this vector U. This actually is closely related to another concept that is commonly used in machine learning, in the machine learning community today. That is the the disentangle representation learning, because if you look at this linear formulation, this vector U essentially defines a direction in the latent space such that when you move your latent representation along this direction, actually you have a younger brain, you generate younger brain to older brain along this direction. So this is essentially a feature disentanglement in the sense that we find a direction in the latent space that is explicitly linked to a specific factor of variation, which in our case is age. Okay, so once having this model, remember this is a generative model, what we can do here is actually we can simulate generative synthesized images given any specific age. For example, I can input 18 here, then it can generate a latent representation in the latent space, and again, generate the corresponding brain image. So we can do this from, for example, from younger brain to older brain, we can clearly observe how the brain changes, the aging pattern based on this generative model. I guess I'm not gonna focus too much on the experimental results on this method because I want my talk to be focusing more on the model part. A little bit detouring here, what I want to say here is that the idea of injecting more informative prior into the latent space, this idea is actually quite versatile. So here I give an example of my other work where I use some sort of Gaussian mixture model plus the Dirichlet process in combination with VAE such that I can formulate a VAE model that can do joint outlier detection and clustering framework. So this is a little bit detouring to explain the framework. Okay, so going back to the confounder part, next I'm gonna, having talked about the image synthesis part, I'm gonna talk about how to train your neural network in a confounder-free fashion. Essentially what I mean here is that assume you have a standard neural network structure where the first part is a bunch of convolutional layers that can extract features from the input image, and then it's connected to a classifier, which is usually a densely connected layers to produce the final, for example, binary diagnosis label. What I want to achieve here is that I want to ensure the prediction of Y is not dependent on your confounder B. Mathematically speaking, or technically speaking, I want to learn the features that are statistically independent of your confounder. And so how should we do this? It's actually, the idea is very simple. It's been out there for several years in the machine learning community for as what it's being called the fair representation learning. So the essential idea is that I want to have another component that try to predict the value of your confounder based on the features, okay? And with this another component, the overarching goal right now is to learn a model such that it can achieve a very accurate prediction for your diagnosis label Y. Meanwhile, you want to have the least accurate prediction for your confounder B. So formally speaking, we want to do this min-max optimization, very similar to the generative adversarial network setting where you optimize a competing objective, two objectives weighted by this lambda parameter. And what is specifically interesting that I want to emphasize here that we formulate a new adversarial loss based on the Pearson correlation. So this one says that upon the convergence of the training, I want the actual ground truth confounder B to have zero correlation with the predicted confounder. So this one means that we want to have a zero dependency between the confounder prediction and the ground truth confounder. If you remember this correlation, the Pearson correlation only quantifies linear dependency between variables. But actually in the paper, we prove a very interesting theory that even though this Pearson correlation is only linked to linear statistical dependency, we can theoretically prove that by this adversarial training, the eventually learned features are actually mean independent with regard to the confounder. So mean independency means that expectation of one variable is not dependent on the other variable. This is actually a much stronger type of independence compared to the zero correlation of linear independence, because it actually removes any nonlinear association between your features and the confounder. So if you're interested, you can look at a paper for the detailed proof. But intuitively speaking, what the method does is that if there's any sort of nonlinear association between features and confounders, then this confounder prediction part will be able to learn that association and try to predict, accurately predict the confounder such that the final correlation is very high. So in other words, reversely speaking, if you have a zero correlation between the ground truth and predicted confounder, it will guarantee that the features are going to be independent of your confounder, linearly or non-linearly. Okay, so I'm going to show the concept of this model first using some synthetic data. We can, for example, construct two groups of images. Each image has 4 blobs, Gaussians, if you will. And the intensity of each blob is constructed by this sigma values. For example, for images in group 1, we want the 4 Gaussians to have higher intensity, then we sample sigma A and sigma B from higher values. And on the other hand, if we want group 2 to have lower intensity, we essentially simulate the sigma parameters in the lower range. And a critical assumption here is that now I assume the sigma A is actually, the difference in sigma A is actually the true group difference that we want to detect, whereas sigma B is actually a confounder of the study. In other words, in an ideal situation, I want to build a model such that the model will predict the group label only based on the diagonal Gaussians, but will not dependent on will be not dependent on the off-diagonal Gaussians. So this is the ideal situation I want to achieve. Okay, so now I apply this adversarial training strategy. Given the images and sigma B, I can control for sigma B using my method. And after training, I can measure the statistical dependency between the learned features and sigma B. And in the top figure, I showed the distance correlation between the features and sigma B. Distance correlation is actually a commonly used metric for measuring any type of statistical dependency between high-dimensional features. We can see that the curve, the purple curve of our method, which is called BRNet, standing for Bias Resilient Neural Network, the distance correlation reduces very fast after training, whereas we compare with some other fire learning methods, the statistical dependency are not fully removed. And this is also supported by the bottom figures, where I can use the test-knee projection to visualize the feature spaces, whether they are associated with the confounder sigma B. So each point in this figure is color-coded by the value of sigma B. We can see that only our method, the BRNet, can learn a feature space that is invariant to sigma B, whereas for other features, for other methods, the learned feature spaces form a clear association between, with respect to the value of sigma B. Okay, so having proved the concept, I applied the method to classify a bunch of healthy subjects with a group of subjects with HIV infection. Here in this study, again, age is going to be a very important confounder because I believe HIV subjects have a higher age range than control subjects. So I basically perform a FIFO cross-validation by performing augmentation of a training fault with random transformations to make the data set balanced. We can see from the table that our method, the BRNet, produces essentially almost the best prediction accuracy result while having the least statistical dependency between the learned features and age. And this is also supported by this distance correlation chart, where, again, the purple curve is our method. As training goes on, it quickly reduces the distance correlation between the learned features and age, so that in the end, we are sure that our prediction is purely based on whether you're an HIV person or a control person, but not based on age. Okay, so again, we can visualize the projection, the projected feature space by Tasny. If you look at the baseline method where you don't care about the age confounder, the learned feature space form a rather clear association with age, where older people are concentrated on the top corner and younger people are on the other, on the lower corner of the space, where on the right, with our method, we learn a feature space that are almost invariant to age. Okay, so finally, I'm going to talk about a visualization technique for interpreting a learned model. Assume you have learned a deep learning model and you want to interpret the model, you want to find brain regions that significantly contribute to the prediction. And how do we remove the confounding effects in this visualization process? And this is what I'm going to tackle here with this method. So I'm going to specifically build the visualization based on a method called layer-wise backpropagation. Essentially, this method produces such heat maps indicating regions that are impacting the decision process of the neural network. And we want to say, we want to basically disentangle which important voxels are actually impacted by disease and which voxels are linked to confounders. Okay, how I'm going to do this? First, let me go into a little bit detail in explaining what this the saliency value at each voxel of this heat map is. It's actually a quantity. It's a partial derivative quantity. So SI is SI term is the final prediction score, and the I of V is the voxel-wise intensity value. It means that if I add a small perturbation to the voxel-wise, to the intensity value of that voxel, how much it will change the final output. So this partial derivative, the magnitude of the partial derivative essentially encodes the importance of that voxel to the final prediction. So this is the heat map, what the heat map essentially means at each voxel. And having understand this, let me take a look at further into this model. How do we disentangle the confounding effects? So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to look at all the features that are learned model, and I'm going to examine feature by feature to say which features are confounded by a confounder, which I named Z here. And how are we going to do this? Actually, what I did was to apply a standard univariate statistical test that are most commonly used in medicine to examine the relationship between the final prediction outcome and the value of each feature and this confounder Z. And this statistical test is based on general linear model. It's basically the most common practice here used in neuroscience. It can identify whether the value of jth feature is confounded by your confounder. And eventually you do this one by one. For each feature, you can generate a binary mask here. When the entry is 1, it means that that feature is not confounded. When it's 0, it means that the feature is confounded. So now, again, I'm going to do a backpropagation in producing that heat map. But the only difference is that I only want to backpropagate through those unconfounded features. But I want to block that backpropagation from the confounded features. In this way, this is what I call a partial backpropagation, because in this way, we can guarantee that the final heat map is only linked to the disease, but not linked to the confounders. This is actually a very conceptual practice, but it actually has a very good mathematical meaning behind it. So if you remember, I talked about this saliency value, voxel-wise saliency value being a partial derivative. Actually, we can use the chain rule to further decompose this value as here. So it turns out that this partial derivative can be formulated as a summation of these subterms, and each term is associated with one feature. This is just the pure chain rule derivation. For example, this one means that the feature, the so-called feature importance, is the partial derivative of the final outcome with respect to one feature. It means that a small perturbation to a feature, how much that will change the final outcome. So this is linked to one feature, and this term, of course, again, is the partial derivative of the feature value with respect to the voxel-wise intensity value. And the idea is that for the confounded features, we want to turn off its contribution by adding this binary term b, this mask term. So if the feature is confounded, then I want to set b to 0 so that this part of the partial derivative linked to this feature is basically shut off. If the feature is unconfounded, then b value is set to 1. Then the final partial derivative will take into account the contribution of this feature. Okay, so this is basically the rationale behind the partial back propagation. And finally, I'm gonna briefly talk about how to implement this very, actually we don't actually need to implement any new code here because what we found out is that there's a simple model refactorization trick that allows you to use the original visualization technique without the need to implement any new code. So the trick is that the partial back propagation want to turn off or set certain components to 0. And this essentially means that well, setting a part of the partial derivative to 0 means basically fixing the value of those entries. So essentially, we designed this dummy layer, which is parameter-free. It only means that you time the feature value with this binary mask and adding those fixed values, which are constant, not learnable by the network. Once you do this, you can actually run the original full back propagation, and it will basically produce the same visualization result. So you don't need to retrain anything. You don't need to implement new visualization pipeline. You just need to refactorize your trained model and apply the original pipeline to visualize the outcome. Okay, so this is the last slice. So again, on the synthetic data, I want to apply this visualization technique. If you don't consider the confounder, apparently the classification will be based on all 4 Gaussians. But if I consider confounders using this visualization technique, we can see that the method is only dependent on the diagonal Gaussian and removing the confounding effects. And finally, going back to the HIV effects, we can apply this technique to visualize the true disease effect, which is on the right here. If you compare it to the original visualization without considering confounder on the left, the difference is actually exactly in the ventricle where, in fact, there's a very significant aging effect there. So it means that with the original method, probably the normal aging is a serious confounding effect that is being learned by the model. And finally, we of course apply this method to many other data sets in Discover neuroscientific findings. One good example is on this Encoder study where we want to distinguish, where we want to identify sex difference in adolescents. Here in this application, the pubertal stage is a very significant confounder because we know that girls hit puberty faster than boys. So we want to do a sex prediction while controlling for the pubertal stage. And again, we can observe very significant difference in the interpretation if you consider or don't consider confounding effects. Okay, so this is the last slide that concludes my talk. Thank you for Dr. Adeli and Dr. Po for the collaboration. And the code is in the GitHub. And I hope they're useful to you in your work. Yeah. All right.